My grandmother kept a tin of lard on the back of the wood stove until she was 91. When I asked her why, she looked at me like I had asked why she needed air. She was born on a homestead outside Moose Jaw in 1921 and raised 6 children through the Depression on a quarter section of dirt. Number 7, she made every Friday for 60 years. Number 15 was so shameful that Prairie women refused to name it at church socials, even when every woman in the congregation had made it that same week. And number 1, food historians call it one of the most ingenious survival recipes on Canadian soil. These meals did not disappear because they stopped working. They disappeared because prosperity taught us to be embarrassed by them. Hit subscribe. Let us count down. Number 25, salt pork and beans, molasses, simmered homestead staple. Every homestead pantry, from the Red River to the Rockies, held a crock of salt pork buried in coarse salt, a cut of pig belly that cost under 15 cents a pound in 1912. Prairie women soaked dried navy beans overnight, then layered them in a cast iron pot with thick slices of cured pork, a spoon of molasses, dry mustard, and water hauled from the well. The pot went into the back of the stove before sunrise and sat there until supper. By evening, the beans were soft and glossy. The pork had rendered sweet and smoky, and the kitchen smelled like something worth surviving a Saskatchewan winter for. Oral histories from Ukrainian and Polish settlements east of Saskatoon recall salt pork and beans on the table 4 nights a week during homesteading years. It required almost no attention, almost no money, and the patience to let time do the work. A crock fed 8 people for under 20 cents. We replaced this with dinner kits that cost $12 and taste of nothing in particular. Number 24, Banic. Flour, lard, baking powder, salt, and enough water to bring it together, mixed in the hand, shaped into a flat round, and cooked in a greased skillet. The outside crisped golden, while the inside stayed soft and doughy enough that children reached for a second piece before the first was finished. In the hungry 30s, Banic was not a side dish. It was the meal. Homestead diaries from the Peace River country describe women stretching 20 pounds of flour across 3 weeks for a family of 7, making the rounds smaller each time until they were barely thicker than a cracker. Eaten with preserves, it was breakfast. Eaten plain, it was lunch. Torn into broth, it was supper. The recipe never changed because it never needed to. Baked in a Dutch oven, buried in coals when the stove wood ran out. Wrapped on a stick over an open fire during harvest. This is a bread that built the West and got pushed off the table when white sandwich loaves arrived by rail. Number 23rd, head cheese. November was butchering time on every prairie farm, and not one part of the pig went to waste. Grandmothers from Galicia, Germany, Poland, and Iceland all arrived with the same knowledge. The head held good eating if you had patience. The pig's head went into the largest pot with peppercorns, bay leaves, vinegar, and onions, simmering 4 or 5 hours until the meat lifted clean from the bone. Women shredded every scrap, mixed it with the reduced cooking liquor, packed it into bread pans, and set it in the cold cellar overnight. By morning, it had firmed into a dense, spiced, sliceable terrine that kept for weeks. Sliced thin on bread with mustard, head cheese was the cold lunch every prairie farm child carried in a tin pail to the one-room schoolhouse. Mennonite oral histories from Steinbach, Manitoba, recall the whole neighborhood gathering for hog butchering, each family going home with a share of every part. Today, head cheese sits at specialty deli counters priced like a delicacy. Number 22nd, fried mush. Prairie women cooked a thick pot of cornmeal porridge at supper, poured the leftovers into a greased loaf pan, and let it set overnight. By morning, it had firmed into something sliceable. They cut it into thick slabs and fried those slabs in lard until both sides turned crisp and golden. The outside crackled, the inside stayed creamy, drizzled with choke cherry jam or the last of the maple syrup. It was a breakfast that cost 3 cents. Some grandmothers dusted slabs in flour before frying to create a crust that shattered at the fork. Others served it with gravy instead of syrup, making it a supper. This was daily fare from the 1880s through the Second World War. Food rationing made it essential again in the 1940s. Then, convenience foods arrived and leftover porridge started getting thrown out instead of cooked a second time. We call food waste a modern problem. Our grandmothers would find that impossible to understand. Number 21, choke cherry syrup. Every August, Prairie children went into the river valleys and coulees with tin pails and came back with hands stained dark purple. Choke cherries were too bitter to eat raw. Simmered with water and sweetened carefully, then strained through cheesecloth overnight, they produced a deep garnet syrup with a flavor unlike anything cultivated in a garden. Prairie women poured it over pancakes, stirred it into porridge, and put it up in mason jars to last through 10 months of winter when no fresh fruit existed within 500 miles. By 1930, a jar of choke cherry syrup was a proper gift between homestead neighbors, the kind of thing left on a porch with a note. Store-bought maple syrup cost money. Most Prairie families did not have. This cost a long afternoon and purple fingers. The choke cherry bushes are still out there, in every river valley in Western Canada. The knowledge of what to do with them in August is nearly gone. Number 20, cracklings. When lard was rendered at butchering time, the bits of pork skin and fat that did not melt down became cracklings. Women spread them on a pan, salted them hot, and set them out. They kept for weeks in a crock and vanished just as fast. Children ate them by the handful. Men ate them standing over the stove before supper. Cracklings went into cornbread batter, crumbled over boiled greens, and stirred into potato soup. Oral histories from the Doukhobor communities in Saskatchewan describe cracklings as the one thing children looked forward to at butchering time, as much as the fresh pork itself. Nothing was purchased. Nothing was wasted. The pig rendered itself useful, right down to the last scrap of skin. Today, the same product sells for $8 a bag at gas stations under the name pork rinds. Number 19, wild rabbit stew. Snowshoe hares ran in cycles across the northern prairies, and during years of abundance, families who had almost nothing could still eat well. 3 or 4 rabbits from a morning's worth of snares went into a pot with onions, turnip, potatoes, and dried herbs. The meat simmered until it fell from the bone, the broth thickened with flour, and the whole thing was served over Banic. Rabbit was free food on the open prairie. A family that maintained their snares could eat through a hard month without spending a cent on meat. Oral histories from communities north of Edmonton describe rabbit stew on the table every night for 3 weeks running during the worst stretch of 1934, and nobody complained. Because the alternative was nothing. Today, rabbit sells at boutique butcher shops as a heritage protein. On the Prairie homestead, it was survival, plain and unsentimental. Number 18. Dandelion greens with bacon. The first green things to emerge from a prairie spring were dandelions, and every homestead grandmother knew exactly what to do with them. Picked young before the flowers opened, the leaves were tender and sharp with bitterness. Women fried salt pork until crisp, removed the meat, and poured the hot fat directly over a bowl of fresh-picked greens, with a splash of vinegar and a pinch of salt. The leaves wilted slightly and the dressing clung to every bitter edge. After a prairie winter with no fresh vegetables from October to May, this dish hit the table in late April like a tonic. Medical records from homesteading communities show the spring appearance of dandelion greens corresponded with an immediate drop in the symptoms prairie doctors attributed to vitamin deficiency. Our grandmothers did not know the clinical word for what they were correcting. They just knew to pick the dandelions. Number 17. Potato soup with dumplings. First pattern break. In the worst years of the Depression, entire prairie families ate potato soup every day for weeks. Not as a choice, as a fact. A woman in southern Saskatchewan in 1933 might have had 60 pounds of potatoes in the root cellar and not much else until April. She made that soup stretch by dropping dumplings into it. Flour, salt, water, a spoon of lard, stirred to a stiff dough and dropped by the spoonful into the simmering broth. The dumplings swelled, thickened the soup, and turned something thin into something filling. Children came to the table and filled their bowls twice. There are still women alive in Manitoba and Saskatchewan who remember eating the soup for 90 days running. They do not describe it with shame. They describe it with a calm precision that is harder to bear than any complaint. Saskatoon berries grew wild across every coulee and hillside from the Manitoba border to the foothills, ripening in late July with a flavor somewhere between blueberry and almond. Prairie women picked them by the gallon pail, put them up in jars, dried them on wooden racks, and baked them into PS that anchored every Sunday table from the 1880s through the 1960s. The filling needed almost no sugar, and the lard crust shattered at the fork in a way no butter crust could match. For early homesteaders, before a garden had been established, Saskatoon berries were the only pie filling that existed. Children were sent out in July and expected to fill a pail before coming home. Blackfoot and Blood Nations had used the berry for sustenance and ceremony long before any settler arrived. Most of us grew up on Saskatoon berry pie and never once thought about how long that knowledge took to reach our table. Number 15. Gopher stew. This is the one nobody mentions at Christmas dinner anymore. During the mid-1930s drought, when crops failed 3 years running, farm children hunted Richardson's ground squirrels. Boys set snares at burrow openings, or flooded them with buckets of water. A good morning produced 8 or 10 of the small animals. Grandmothers from Eastern Europe recognized the animal for what it was: small game that required nothing to obtain except time. Skinned, cleaned, and simmered with onions and whatever vegetables remained, Gopher produced a genuine broth and enough meat to matter. Federal relief records from 1934 and 1935 document the practice across rural Saskatchewan and Alberta. Church leaders urged families not to feel ashamed. The shame came later, when the rains returned and nobody wanted to remember. This was not failure. This was what it looked like to refuse to let your children go hungry. Number 14. Blood sausage. The pig gave everything, and the blood was no different. Caught in a clean pail at butchering, seasoned with salt, pepper, marjoram, and cooked barley, then packed into casings and poached gently. Blood sausage was the first meat eaten after butchering, because it kept the shortest time. Grandmothers from German, Ukrainian, and Hungarian settlements made it in the style of the old country. The seasoning a point of family pride. Sliced thick and fried until the edges crisped, and served with fried onions and dark bread. It was a supper that cost nothing, beyond what was already in the kitchen. Mennonite oral histories from the Interlake describe butchering as a neighborhood event, families cooperating and each going home with a portion of every part. Today, blood sausage appears at specialty counters. Restaurants call it boudin noir and price it accordingly. Number 13. Vinegar pie. This one was kept quiet. Depression-era Prairie women called it by different names. Transparent pie. Poor man's lemon pie. The recipe was simple to the point of embarrassment. Eggs, sugar, butter, flour, water, and a generous pour of apple cider vinegar. Beaten together and baked in a lard crust, it set firm and tasted faintly, inexplicably, of citrus. There was no lemon. There was acid and sweetness, and the combination fooled a hungry palate into something that felt like a treat. Prairie women brought this to church socials in the 1930s without announcing what was in it, and people ate second slices without suspicion. The ingredients cost less than a dime when lemons cost money. Nobody had. An entire generation of Prairie children grew up believing their grandmothers made a tart custard pie from a recipe that could never quite be reproduced. It was never secret. It was just easier not to explain. Number 12. Fatback on bread. Third pattern break. When the meal ran thin in January and the flour was almost gone, a thick slice of bread spread with fatback and sprinkled with salt was the meal. Not a side dish. The meal. The bread was dense, the fat cold and salty, and the combination of fat and starch gave the body what it needed to keep functioning in a cold house. Prairie homestead diaries from the 1930s record this without commentary. The way people record facts rather than complaints. Had bread and fat for dinner. Children ate without argument. This was not nostalgia waiting to happen. This was the edge. Prairie women who kept the lard tin on the stove their whole lives were not being sentimental. They had learned that comfort is temporary and preparation is not. Number 11. Sauerkraut and pork. German, Ukrainian, Polish, and Czech settlers arrived with centuries of fermentation knowledge and applied it immediately. Cabbage grew reliably in every prairie garden and kept poorly without processing. Women shredded it, packed it into crocks with salt, weighted it with a clean stone, and left it to ferment. Within 3 weeks, it was sauerkraut, capable of lasting all winter in the cold cellar without a jar or lid. Come January, a pot of sauerkraut simmered with a pork hock appeared on the table twice a week in every German and Ukrainian settlement east of Saskatoon. The pork softened, the brine mellowed, and the fat from the hock enriched the whole pot into something deeply satisfying. Oral histories describe sauerkraut as the food that kept great-grandparents alive through their first terrible prairie winter, when almost everything else had gone wrong. It asked nothing but time and a few pounds of salt. Lake Winnipeg gold turned vivid gold when hot smoked over oak and green willow. and prairie families who could not afford much else in winter protein kept a supply. The fish held for months without refrigeration, tasted of wood smoke, sweet flesh, and salt, and eaten on dark bread. They were a meal in themselves. Women shredded smoked goldeye into potato soup for depth, mixed it into cream sauces over potatoes, and set a whole fish on the Friday table without apology. By the 1950s, Winnipeg goldeye had become famous enough to be sent as a gift to foreign heads of state. Today, it is a delicacy with a waiting list at the last real smokehouse. For 3 generations of prairie grandmothers, it was Tuesday's supper. Holubtsai in Ukrainian, pigs in blankets in every small-town cafe, from Portage la Prairie to Prince Albert. Whatever the name, the architecture was the same: cooked rice, fried onions, and whatever quantity of ground meat could be managed. Rolled tight in softened cabbage leaves, packed into a roasting pan, and baked low and slow in tomato sauce. 1 head of cabbage and a pound of rice produced enough rolls to feed 10 people, making this the essential dish at every harvest supper and community gathering across the prairie settlements. Women in the block settlements outside Vegreville, Alberta, recall making 400 cabbage rolls at a time for harvest crews, rolling by lamplight while children slept. No special equipment, no expensive ingredients, just patience and a kitchen table wide enough to work. Before the homesteaders, before the railways, before the Dominion had a western border worth measuring, pemmican was the food that made the Canadian West possible. Developed over centuries by the Cree, Assiniboine, and other Plains nations, it was dried bison, pounded fine and mixed with rendered fat and dried berries, pressed into hide bags that kept for years without spoiling. Voyageurs survived on it. The Northwest Company shipped it by the ton. Prairie grandmothers of Métis heritage carried the recipe into the homesteading era, adapting it to deer and moose when the bison were gone. A pound delivered more calories than almost any food of equivalent weight, and kept without refrigeration through any prairie summer. The Hudson's Bay Company's entire Western enterprise ran on it. We now call the principle behind it an energy bar, and we sell it for $4 at the airport. Number 7, lard and molasses bread. 4th pattern break. This was what my grandmother made every Friday. Not because Friday was special, because the week's bread was finished, and this was faster than waiting for yeast dough to rise. She made a quick dough, baked it in 2 loaves, pulled it hot from the oven, and cut thick slices immediately. Each slice got a scrape of lard and a pour of blackstrap molasses. The lard melted into the warm bread, the molasses spread, dark and bittersweet over everything. Prairie families called this the Friday bread, the bread that meant the week was ending, the bread nobody had to be called twice for. Molasses cost 20 cents for a tin in the 1920s and lasted months. Lard was rendered at home. The entire meal cost under 3 cents per person. When I make this now, my children think it is a recipe I invented. This was not invention. This was the whole country at supper for 50 years. First Nations women across the prairies had been drying corn for winter use long before European settlement arrived, and the homesteaders who learned from their neighbors ate better for it. Dried corn on the cob or cut on racks kept through any winter. Rehydrated in a long simmer with beans and whatever meat was available, it produced a soup thick and filling enough that a single bowl was a meal. The Three Sisters version corn, beans, and squash together appeared in settler cookbooks under different names, but with the same logic. These three plants fed each other in the soil and fed people together in the pot. The dried corn gave the soup a sweet, slightly smoky depth that fresh corn never achieves. We now buy fresh corn year-round and have lost the knowledge of what it becomes when you dry it. Number 5, pickled pig's feet. Every general store from Winnipeg to the foothills kept a large glass jar of pickled pig's feet on the counter, simmered until tender, then submerged in a brine of vinegar, salt, peppercorns, and bay leaves for a week. They produced something gelatinous, sharp, and intensely savory. Prairie men ate them as a working lunch. Women served them cold with boiled potatoes and mustard. Oral histories from Czech and Slovak communities in the Crow's Nest Pass describe pickled pig's feet as the food their fathers ate every Saturday at noon without fail, bought from the butcher for a nickel apiece. The preparation required hours, the result kept for weeks. Today, pig's feet appear on menus at restaurants specializing in whole animal cooking, described as a rediscovery. Our grandmothers would like to have a word. Number 4, oatmeal porridge with rendered fat. This is so simple, it barely sounds like a recipe, which is exactly why it disappeared. Oatmeal cooked long and slow on the wood stove became a thick porridge that Prairie children ate before walking 3 miles to school, in weather that stopped being described once it passed 40 below. The part that vanished was what went on top, not brown sugar, a spoonful of pork lard or beef tallow, and a pinch of salt. The fat melted in, and the salt brought out a depth that sweetened oatmeal cannot match. This was the breakfast that sustained farm labor from sunup through mid-morning without complaint. Nutrition researchers who have studied traditional prairie diets note that fat-soluble vitamins in animal fat made this genuinely more sustaining than the sweetened versions that replaced it. Our grandmothers did not know that phrase. They just knew it held. Number 3, mustard pickle. If there is one jar that sat on every prairie table from 1890 through 1970, it is this one. Green tomatoes that had not ripened before frost, overgrown cucumbers, cauliflower, green beans, pearl onions. The garden's end-of-season surplus was cut up, brined overnight, then cooked in vinegar, mustard powder, turmeric, and sugar until the whole kitchen turned the color of a summer afternoon. Poured into mason jars, mustard pickle lasted all winter and went on the table with everything. On salt pork, on head cheese, on cold boiled potatoes, on the bread and lard suppers of February. The sharpness of the vinegar and the heat of the mustard cut through every heavy, starchy thing the prairie winter demanded. Women who homesteaded before electricity described the canning season as the most exhausting and most important work of the year. A pantry full of mustard pickle was a pantry full of confidence. The recipe survives in handwritten notebooks and church cookbooks that nobody has yet digitized. Mennonite grandmothers from Steinbach and Winkler in Manitoba and from the communities outside Coaldale in Alberta made a borscht so different from the restaurant version that the two dishes share almost nothing but the name. No beets. Instead, a ham bone simmered for hours with a whole head of cabbage, potatoes, tomatoes from August, dill, and a pour of cream stirred in at the last moment. Sweet from the cabbage, sour from the tomatoes, rich from the cream and pork. It was made in a pot large enough to last 3 days, and it improved with each reheating. In the Mennonite settlements that arrived on the Manitoba prairies in the 1870s, borscht was the food of gathering. The soup appeared when neighbors came to raise a barn, when the community came together after a funeral, when one pot was the only answer. Oral histories describe the smell of cabbage borscht as the smell of not being alone on the open prairie. The grandmothers who know it best are in their 80s. Number 1. Rhubaboo. Here's the one food historians are only now beginning to fully understand. Rhubaboo was the daily meal of the Métis Nation and the fur trade brigades. At its simplest, pemmican dissolved in boiling water, thickened with a handful of flour, and eaten from a communal pot. In more settled times, prairie grandmothers of Métis heritage made it with dried meat and fresh game, simmering it with wild roots and dried berries until it reached a thick, porridge-like consistency. It required no dishes beyond the pot. It could be made over an open fire in a driving prairie snowstorm. It delivered fat, protein, and carbohydrate in a single bowl. Those who grew up on it insist it tasted like nothing a modern kitchen can produce, because the ingredients no longer exist in the form they once did. Wild pemmican. True dried Saskatoon. The fat of bison that had never seen a feedlot. Elder knowledge keepers in Métis communities across the prairies are actively working to preserve the recipe, understanding that what is at stake is not just food, but the memory of how this land fed its first peoples and how that knowledge kept everyone who came after them alive. 25 meals, one story. These were not recipes from cookbooks. They came from cold cellars, hard winters, and women who refused to let their families go hungry. Tell me in the comments which one your grandmother made. And tell me if you still know where the chokecherry bushes grow.